what happened was I had written this movie. It was called Crosscut. I wrote it with David Maisel, who's a really terrific novelist, and the director, whose name was Paul Raimondi. And I'm done with this. I'm never going to collaborate on anything ever again. I'm done with Hollywood. So I decided, well, what do I know that I could get published? And I thought, well, a crime novel, because I know all these crime writers, and I knew Patrick Reynal, who was Crumley's publisher in Paris. And I thought, well, at least I'll get it published someplace, probably. So I wrote The Ice Harvest. What I knew I wanted to do was I wanted to write a novel set at Christmas time, because I worked retail for a long time, and I grew to hate Christmas. I love it now, but I learned to hate it. I hated the songs. I hated, you work in a mall for a 9-hour shift, and you will hear the Little Drummer Boy more often than you want to fucking hear it. A lot more. So I was just writing that stuff, and I remembered a particularly cold winter, which was actually 1978 in Wichita, where it was always snowing, always icy, just a bad time getting around. So I'm going to set that, because it was a time when I had been hanging around strip clubs a lot. For several reasons, mostly because my friend Ben Urish, U-R-I-S-H, Urish, was studying them. He was getting his master's in anthropology. And so we would go to these clubs and say we were doing research, but we actually were, because Ben got a degree out of it, and I wrote a book about it. But I thought, I'm just going to write a book about strip clubs at Christmas time, and I'm going to make it up as I go along. And probably screenwriting did affect, because my first novel, you look at it and it's terrible. I hope you'll never find it. It only exists in Xeroxes, but I'm finding a disturbing number of Xeroxes of it floating around among my friends. But yeah, I think I did get much more visual, because I learned that I just learned about getting a feeling about a place, and the sense that place was important, and that, describing a room just a little bit helps put a reader in a mood. Charlie is a version of me. Charlie is me if I had gotten married to my college girlfriend, had a few kids, decided it wasn't for me, went to law school, and just took everything, just the path of least resistance. And yeah, I think there's an element of me in Charlie, and so I was kind of able to just, well, what would he do now? What would he do now? And it's never going to be the right thing. It's always going to be the lazy thing. But I got to be very fond of him, as you do with characters, even if they're acting like assholes. Vic, and I can say this now, I denied it for years, but Vic was based a little bit on a real guy, a very, very charismatic Wichita hoodlum by the name of George Polis. And George terrified everybody, but a lot of people, my dad knew him a little bit, just they'd run into each other downtown, or they'd see each other at the lunch counter, and they, my dad really liked him, but he said, yeah, George is a bad person. He wrote a very funny memoir called George, You Rascal You, and he copped to everything but murder. And my dad said, you know why that is, right? Because there's no statute of limitations on murder. But he was an arsonist and all this. And I kind of based Vic on my idea of George. I don't know how close they really were, but people were always asking me, is that George? And I said, no, absolutely not. I didn't know how I was going to end Ice Harvest, because I kind of wanted to kill Charlie off, but I kind of was never quite the right time. And I got to a point where I thought, well, maybe he's gonna, just drive off into the sunset. But I had, and I'm not going to say what it is, because presumably there are people out there who will, go out and haven't read it yet, and maybe will want to read it. But the the way it ends is something I had in my mind, and I sort of set it up early in the book. And at a certain point I got to it and I thought, I'm going to try this. And I tried it, and I think that turned out to be the thing that made people notice the book, because it was a surprise, the way it ends. And I think that was a lucky thing for me that I decided to end it that way, because it really did. One guy told me, a bookseller, luckily, told me, I woke my wife up in the middle of the night reading this book. I said, holy shit. And I thought, that's really good. I'm really happy to hear that.